We're going to go back to the insects that we were looking at yesterday, the class Insecta, order Hymenoptera. And remember that the order Hymenoptera is a type of insect, so they have all the characteristics of insects. The class Insecta is part of the phylum Arthropoda, so they have all the characteristics of the phylum Arthropoda. And the phylum Arthropoda is part of the kingdom Animalia. So arthropods have all the characteristics of animals. And finally, kingdom Animalia is part of the domain Eukarya. So animals have all the characteristics of the domain Eukarya. So every time we go down a level in classification, the organisms we're looking at have the characteristics of all the levels above that they're classified in. So we were looking at human genetics. And basically, human genetics is pretty boring. What can I say? At least in terms of talking about the numbers of chromosomes. So we were looking at the genetic relationship between a woman and her daughter, and we said a daughter inherits 23 of her 46 chromosomes from mom. So there's a 50% or 1/2 genetic similarity. A daughter inherits half of her chromosomes from mom, and the odds that another sister gets that same half is 50% or 1/2. So if we look at two girls, they also have 50% or 1/2 genetic similarity because they get half of their chromosomes from mom and half of those chromosomes are the same. So if we multiply, that's a fourth. They get half of their chromosomes from dad and half of those chromosomes are the same. So that's another quarter. So 1/4 plus 1/4, 1/2. Now let's think about insects. In particular, the order Hymenoptera, the eusocial insects. When biologists first discovered them, they really couldn't figure out why you would have a whole group of individuals that don't try to reproduce. That didn't make much sense. We know that biologically, the drive to reproduce is very strong. Turns out when we look at hymenopterans, the key is in their genetics. So let's look at a family pedigree of some bees or some ants. And if we look at these organisms, they have a different type of genetic system that's sometimes called haplodiploidy. Now remember in 105, we talked about haploid cells, cells that were 1N, cells that had one copy of each chromosome. And we talked about diploid cells, cells that were 2N, cells that had two copies of each chromosome. Well, if we look at the ants and bees and wasps that are eusocial, females are diploid, but males are haploid. So we have to take a little detour. We have to talk a little bit about the genetics of these organisms. And one way to do it is compare it to what we see in people. In people, both genders, male and female, are diploid. They have the 2N number of chromosomes, as opposed to in these insects where males are haploid, but females are diploid. Notice I gave our imaginary insects here 46 chromosomes like people so we could compare them. I don't know of any particular species of ant or bee or wasp that has 46 chromosomes. There could be one that I'm not aware of. Now let's think about how reproduction occurs. In people, a woman typically releases one egg when she ovulates each month during her menstrual cycle. Sometimes two, which is how you get twins, or three, which is how you get triplets, but usually one egg. Now, if a woman has had sex for about 3 days before she ovulates, there is evidence that the sperm can live inside the female reproductive tract in a person for up to about 3 days. So potentially if a woman had sex 3 days before she ovulated, she might be able to get pregnant. The evidence is that that's very rare and doesn't happen, but it could occur. Now, when she releases the egg, when she ovulates, that egg stays viable, it can be fertilized for about 2 days. So she could potentially have sex 2 days after she ovulated and she could become pregnant. So there's a total of about 5 days every menstrual cycle when a woman is fertile. The other days she's not fertile. So people who use what's called the rhythm method of birth control try to have sex on some of the days other than those 5 days. Now, insects are very different. So let's think about our queen bee up here, or queen ant, whatever she happens to be. If we look at most types of ants and bees, they only make new queens at one time of the year. Here around Chicago, the ants and bees usually get made in October and September. It's hard to tell with the bees, but with the ants, it's pretty easy to tell when they're being made, at least if you watch insects, because ants normally crawl, but when new queen ants are made, they have wings. And what they do is they fly away from the anthill and they settle down to form a new anthill. Now, on their flight, they mate with males. Males are only produced when an anthill is making queens or when a beehive is making queens. The males basically chase after the female as she's flying away. If they catch her, they mate with her. But unlike in people where sperm can survive for a couple of days, when a female ant or bee mates, she can save the sperm for 20 or 30 years potentially. And in people, it takes several million sperm when a male ejaculates to fertilize one egg. When a female ant or bee, when the queen lays an egg, she can release the egg, and she has an organ where she stores the sperm. She can release one sperm cell, and that sperm cell will fertilize the egg.
No problem.
I'm sorry, what? So if the sperm cell fertilizes the egg, it develops into a female because females are diploid. Now, in people, if an egg isn't fertilized, it doesn't develop into a person. In eusocial insects, the ants and bees and wasps, if an egg isn't fertilized, it develops into a male. Males are haploid. So notice when this queen produces males, they all have exactly the same DNA. So because, or I should say when these males pass down their DNA from what we're looking at. So let's think about our queen and her daughter. Her daughter's got 46 chromosomes, 23 came from dad. Notice that all this queen's daughters are going to get the same 23 chromosomes because most ants and bees mate with one male. So all the sperm that they have stored are going to have the same chromosomes. So this girl gets 23 chromosomes from mom, 23 chromosomes from dad. So from that point of view, a queen bee, a queen ant, is 50% or 1/2 genetically the same as her daughters, exactly the same as in people. The difference is when we look at the genetic relationship between two daughters. Let's think about these two girls. Each of these girls gets 23 chromosomes from her mom. Now, the chance that her sister gets the same chromosome is 1/2. So half the chromosomes come from mom, half of them are the same. So 1/4 of the chromosomes in two sisters are identical because of what they inherit from mom. Now, each of these girls also gets 23 chromosomes from their father. Think about this. The father only has 23 chromosomes. So everything that these girls get from the father is exactly the same. So instead of 1/4 of the chromosomes being the same, if we're thinking about the father, 1/2 of the chromosomes that a female ant gets comes from her father, and they're all the same. So if we look at two sisters, a fourth of their chromosomes are the same. They come from the mother. A half of them are the same. They come from the father. So if we look at the genetic similarity between two sisters, the genetic similarity between two sisters is 75%, or 3/4 if you prefer a fraction. Now, a mother is only 50% the same as her daughter genetically, because mom passes down half of her genes. So keep in mind what we've been saying. What's the ultimate goal of all living things? To reproduce, which really means to pass down as much of your DNA to the next generation as possible. So think about what this means in practical terms. If you're a female bee and you're trying to pass down as much of your DNA to the next generation as you can, if you're a female bee and you produce a daughter, you pass down half of your DNA. If you're a female bee, and instead of having your own daughter, you help your mother successfully produce a daughter, you've passed down 3/4 of your DNA. So for bees and ants and wasps that are eusocial, they can be more successful in passing down their DNA by helping their mother raise sisters instead of by having their own daughters, because every sister shares 3/4 of their genes. Every daughter only shares a half of their genes. So if your mom makes 50 sisters, that's more of your DNA going into the next generation than if you make 50 daughters. Now, despite this, the drive to reproduce is very strong. And if we look at queen bees and queen ants, they do secrete chemicals, and all the little worker bees and the worker ants groom the queen, which basically means they lick her, they take bacteria off her skin. But as they groom her, they end up licking up some of these chemicals. And these chemicals suppress the development of their reproductive systems. So even though genetically it makes more sense for them to help mom raise sisters, it still takes a little kind of a chemical shove to get them to give up reproducing on their own. There's one mammal that is eusocial. Does anybody know what mammal is eusocial? In the case of the only mammal that's eusocial, they don't have just one reproductive female. They have several males and several females who are reproductive. And the way that they keep all the other individuals subservient is through some secretions, similar to what the bees and ants make. So as all the submissives, all the non-reproductives groom them, they lick up these chemicals, and these chemicals prevent their reproductive system from developing. They're called naked mole rats. If you've ever seen them, they look pretty disgusting. There are some in the one of the rooms out at Brookfield Zoo, and they kind of look like a little model of Jabba the Hutt. They're these little blobs. They're called mole rats. They're actually more closely related to rodents, but they do live underground. They dig extensive tunnels, but there are only a few reproductive males and females. They are not haplodiploid. They do this entirely by the secretions that the reproductive individuals produce. So when we look at insects, they have all sorts of different ways of surviving. And one of the reasons that it took biologists so long to figure out why most of the bees and ants in a hive or a hill don't reproduce, we weren't looking for males and females having different numbers of chromosomes. There was kind of this hidden assumption that they had the same number of chromosomes, but it turned out to be incorrect. So when we look at this, this can help to explain why we have all these individuals that don't reproduce. Now, we have one more phylum of animals that are classified as invertebrates. And these are what are called Echinodermata. Echino means spiny, and dermat, like a dermatologist, is the skin. So they have little bumps on their skin. And this includes sea stars, which most people call starfish, but they're not really fish. It also includes some things called sea lilies, sand dollars, which got their name because they resemble coins, at least some people thought they did, sea urchins, and sea cucumbers, which aren't cucumbers either. And echinoderms are very closely related to the phylum that we're classified in, the Chordata. And this is true even though they don't look very similar. Think about a sea star. You're probably more familiar with that than any other members of this group. They don't look very similar to any chordates that you're familiar with. They don't look like a fish, really. They don't look like an amphibian or a reptile or a mammal or a bird. The reason that they're very closely related is because echinoderms are the main group, other than chordates, that are deuterostomes. Now, remember, we talked a little bit about protostomes earlier. And in protostomes, when we look at the blastula, that developmental stage that all animals go through, it's kind of a solid ball of cells. And at one point towards the end of the development of blastula, the cells start to push into the middle. And this first opening in a protostome becomes the mouth. Proto is first or beginning, stome means mouth. And the second opening that forms later during development becomes the anus of their digestive system. In deuterostomes and chordates, the first opening becomes the anus and the second opening becomes the mouth. So this is how we know that they're closely resembled, that they're closely related to chordates. The other thing is, if we continue to follow development, we see that some species have a larva that resembles the larva of some of the chordates and vertebrates. So they're related for this reason. Now, the larvae are bilaterally symmetrical, which means they have a right and a left side that are approximately mirror images of each other. But during the larval stage, the left side of the body starts to grow and gradually absorbs the right side. And this is why when we look at adults, if you think about most sea stars, they have something that's often referred to as pentaradial symmetry. Most echinoderms have 5 distinct regions in the body that are essentially equal to each other. Echinoderms do have something called a water vascular system. So think of our cardiovascular system that pumps blood through our body. This pumps water through a series of canals and into some bumps on their skin. They have several different types of bumps. These bumps are called tube feet. And they can pump the water out of the tube feet. And when they pump the water out of the tube feet, this creates a partial vacuum. And so they can use this to hang on to a rock. And if we're talking about a sea star, they can use it to hang by one arm, kind of like a little kid might hang from the monkey bars at the playground. So when we look at these echinoderms, they don't look very similar, but they're actually are closely related to chordates. So here's a sea star. And if you would look at a sea star, they do have a mouth, and the mouth is surrounded by something called a ring canal. And it leads to radial canals that go down each of the arms. And then there's something called an ampulla, which is a sac of some muscle cells. And this sac of muscle cells controls whether the water goes into the tube feet or out of the tube feet. And the tube feet can be used for suction. They can be used for hanging onto a rock, as I said, but they can also be used to attach to a prey organism. Because even though they might look like they should be vegetarians, most of the organisms in this group are actually carnivorous. They eat other organisms. Now, like several of the other groups we've talked about, echinoderms are limited to marine habitats. We don't find echinoderms in freshwater. We don't find them on land at all. There are no echinoderms that are parasitic. If you think about the groups we've talked about, all the worms included some parasitic members. The insects include some parasitic members. So most animal groups do include some parasites. Are there any questions about the invertebrates? Okay, if not, we're going to stop sharing and we're going to look at the 1-5